Hey, what's up? My name is Chris, and welcome to Coding in Public. Today is the second and final in this series on building out a custom accessible tab component. Today I'm going to show you how to write the JavaScript, and we're going to do it in more of an object-oriented programming way than I've done in the past. And then also, I'm going to show you how to set this as a module and then use it that way. That way everything is scoped locally to your JavaScript file. Now, let me go ahead and preview kind of what it looks like. I did this last time briefly, but you can see here we've got these different tab groups. If I go to scroll like this, these vertical tabs stay to the top. That's what we did last time together. We've also got horizontal class groups as well. And now let's go ahead and jump into the JavaScript. Now, if you want to follow along with me, you can come up here to the GitHub. I'll go ahead and add a link in the description. Make sure you come to lesson 2. You can grab that, hit the code here and download it. Of course, if you did lesson 1 already, you probably have the right code, but you can grab that and compare yours to it if you need to. Okay, let's go ahead and jump over and get started. The first thing we're going to do is add a script, src here, and we're going to say this needs to be in the same directory here, and we're going to do tabs, app.js, like that. We do need to add a defer attribute, so it loads after the body, and then I'm going to say up here, let's see, tabs, app.js. All right, and then to make sure everything is working, let's do console.log, hi. And then I'll come over here and do Command Option J to pull that up, and everything seems to be connected. Now let's go ahead and think through what we're going to need. And by talking about object-oriented programming, a lot of times you see tutorials on more functional programming where you write functions that then just do things on DOM elements or insert stuff. With object-oriented programming, what you're trying to do is, in a sense, find patterns in the code and then write things that will deal with multiple instances of that same thing. Now, this is actually how the browser itself works as well. With each element that you add in the browser and with each type in JavaScript, there's actually like a parent class, more or less, that controls different properties and methods that live on that object. So let me come in here and just show you what I mean. You can demonstrate that by coming in here and let's say I add, let's see, an array 1, and it's got a couple things in here. Let's have like hi and bye. All right, perfect. And if I go ahead and console.dir that, like this, array 1, I'm going to get back several things. You'll notice I get the 2 items in the array, but there's also this sneaky thing called a prototype. Now, what in the world is this? Well, basically, an array is a type of object here, and an array is going to come with all these things attached to it. Now, look at all these functions that just come default with an array. Now, where do those come from? Well, they actually come from the browser. In other words, there's kind of this mama array, this mama object, that the array basically inherits all of these methods, and it inherits things like length, which is a property. It inherits all this kind of stuff from the parent. And then you'll notice here, it's a special kind of object, so it's got its prototype. And I've also just got a lot of the things that live on an object here as well. So all of these come by default whenever you create something like an array. So everything in JavaScript ultimately is an object, and that's why it's often said that way. So what we're going to do is use that kind of thinking, and we're going to ask a couple of questions as we get started here. The first question is, what's unique to each group? Now, if you look at this array, the thing that's unique to it is its different items here. It's got hi and it's got bye. All right, so that's what makes it special. That's the first question to ask. And the second question to ask is, okay, when it comes to these shared things, is there anything that all of our tab groups are going to share? And if so, we're going to make sure that they can all access that from kind of the parent, the mama that we're going to create, the mama tab controller. Okay, so the way we're going to do this is, first of all, let me go ahead and hide this panel. We'll come over this way. Let's clear all this out. Let's pull this down and let's think through kind of the steps. So if I were to come in here and let's see, we got our tab 1 and our tab 2. So we're going to have 2 of these, tab 2. They're each going to have unique values that are going to be different depending on which tab we're talking about. So they're going to have different IDs to start with, right? They're going to have different directions maybe. Remember we set one vertical and one horizontal. They're going to have different tabs. They're going to have different panels. And then they're going to have different event listeners. Now we could do an event listener on the window, but it makes sense just to bind them to the actual instance. So this is what they're going to have unique, if I can get this to work for me here. So tab 1 is going to have all that, and tab 2 is going to have all that. Now this event listener is essentially, we're going to write a method to do this, and same thing for this tab 2. So that's what they're going to share in common. Now, what are the things that they need access to outside of that? Well, both the tabs and the panels, let's see, shared items. They're both going to need to show and hide tabs, and they're both going to need to show and hide panels. So at least those things are going to be consistent between the two. I'm saving this and it's yelling at me because it doesn't know what this is because it ain't JavaScript. So, all right, so let's go ahead and kind of break this out. And what we're going to do is we're going to create what's called a class, which is basically a special kind of function that creates an object. And so what we're going to do first of all is just say const list1. Then we're going to say equals new, and that is allowing us to reference this class we're going to write. And we're going to add it here called Tablist, and we're going to create that class in a second. We want to create this list1 from the ID here of list1. Now, why am I naming it list1? Well, that's the ID that our first tab listing had. Now, if I save this, it's going to throw an error because we haven't created this yet. But I'm going to come up here and say class, like that, tablist, and you notice that the convention is to capitalize the class if you're creating a class here, and then we'll add it in brackets like this. So this class is a special function that creates an object. Now, if you're more interested in object-oriented programming, the Net Ninja did a really great tutorial a couple of years back. I'll make sure to link that in the description, and I'll also add some other links to some articles and things like that I found that were a big help. Now, in order for a class to create an object, it needs to know basically how to construct it. So I'm going to come in here and say constructor, and then we're going to add the things we want to add. So we're going to add an ID, and eventually we're going to want to add a direction, which I'm just going to call dir. And then we're going to give the class instructions on how it should create each of these tab lists. So we're going to say, let's first of all set properties that are unique to it. And you might remember we had an ID, we had our direction, we had tabs, we had panels, and then we also had event listeners. All right, so this is what we're going to set for each of these. Now, the way we're going to do this is we're going to say for this instance, so if class is kind of the mama, then the way you reference each of the children inside of this constructor when you're creating them is with the this keyword. So this.id is going to be equal to the ID we passed in. So the instance of that we're creating here, its ID will be set to whatever we passed in. Same thing here, this.dir is going to be set to the dir we passed in. Now, we haven't passed in any tabs, but we're actually going to use methods and some more classes we're going to write to generate these. So we're going to say this.tabs is equal to, and then eventually we'll set it to something, but for now, let's just do an empty array. And same thing here, this.panels is equal to, and for now, we're just going to do an empty array. And for event listeners, for now, let's just comment this out. We're going to write a method that these are all going to share, and we'll add it in here. If I go ahead and save this here, and then let's go ahead and console log this, you'll notice I get here its properties of the individual tab list. And this is the tab list that we generated. And notice, interestingly enough, there's a prototype on this. And it tells me what constructed it. Here's what made it. This tab list is what made it. And actually will give us all the details about that as well. Because it's an object, it also has all the prototype elements of an object here as well. But you'll notice that this comes pre-built because we use this new keyword and have created our own little class. Now, I could come down here and I could write a function, and the way you would do that here, or a method, same thing because it lives on this object, I could say like function say hi, like this, and then I could say console.log hi. Now, it's not going to run or anything like that, and in fact, I forgot I don't need this function keyword. I can just say hi right there. But what I can do now, if I come back over here to this console log, you'll notice that I've got now the panels, the tabs, all those properties, but when I expand this prototype, I now have access to this function because it lives on the parent, the mama, the class. And so we're going to be able to use that to interact with it from any of the children, from any of the instances. So we don't want to say hi. What is it that we want to be accessible for all the children? Well, we want them to be able to get their tabs. And so each of them are going to be able to use methods that we're going to write to get their own tabs. So let's write that. We're going to call it Initialize Tabs, like that. Now, the first thing we need to do is figure out if an ID has been passed in. So in this instance, we're going to say if this.id does not exist. So on the instance that this gets passed in on, if that happens, let's go ahead and just throw an error. So we'll throw a new error, and we'll say you must pass an ID when initializing. Now, if I save this right now, nothing is going to change, but let's say I didn't pass in an ID. All right, if I just leave it blank like this, And then I come in here. Now I've got these items, and because it just lives down here, it's not doing anything yet. But what we can call is on the child here, which is called list1, we can call that method, which was called initialize tabs. And if I do that here, I'm now going to get an error that corresponds to what I just typed in here. Now, if I don't add this and it's looking for an ID, it will just throw up some kind of nonsense text here where it's going to try to tell them what to do. But by adding my own text here, I get to tell the user, hey, if there's a problem, here's specifically what the problem is. An ID wasn't passed in. So that's kind of what we're doing here. All right, let's get this back properly this way. Now, once we've done that check, which we'll just do on initialize tabs, and it should work after that, then what we want to do is we want to return something. So what we're going to do is on the instance that we passed in, we're going to first of all get the tab list itself. We want to get an array of all the tabs connected to this tab list. So we can use a spread operator here, and just like this, say document dot query selector. We're going to do query selector all because we want all, and then here in backticks, we're going to pass in, let's do a £, and then an E6 template string for the this.id, so the child instance here. We want to do a space now and do everything that is a role of tab inside of the ID. And if we do this like this, we can come back over this way and initialize tabs, and now we're getting an array of all the different buttons inside of here. Now, when you build stuff live, you realize that sometimes you mess up, and that's definitely what we've done here, because notice we're getting 7 different buttons, but this one should only have 4, which tells me that probably I didn't change the list to 1. Let's go check. So let's look for list 1. I've got 2. That's bad. All right, so this should be list 2, like that. All right, so now let's come back this way, and let's run that again, and now we should only get the 3 that we want. All right, live action here. Oh, and I changed the wrong one. Okay, just a second. I'll be right back with you. All right, hopefully you enjoyed that intermission. Let's see. Okay, there we go. The 4 we need. Okay, the first 4. Okay, cool. So now we're getting those. Let's get rid of this little find window here. We don't just want to return it like that, though. What we actually want to do is let's set this to this dot initialize tab. So go ahead and run the method immediately when you construct it. And if we do that, we don't have the console log anymore. It'll actually just show here as the tabs like this, because this is what it's returning. Now, what we want to do is not just to return an array, we actually want to attach our own little methods to each of these tabs so that each of the tabs have the opportunity to hide or show themselves and things like that. So what are we going to do? We're going to create another class called tabs. So let's go ahead and do that up top. So we're going to say class tab like that. And then inside of here, we need our own constructor here. And here we're going to pass in whatever tab instance we're passing in. And we're going to just say this.tab is equal to tab. All right, so the tab that's passed in is its own tab. Now, each of these are going to have different things that they can do that they're all going to share. So in other words, we're creating another like prototype. And what we're going to do is say, we want them to all share these kinds of methods. Well, what are the methods we want them to share? We want them to be able to show their tab. So let's go ahead and say this.tab. So that's the thing that was passed in here. .set attribute. We're going to set the aria selected attribute. We're going to set to aria selected like that. We're going to set it to true. So when they're showing their tabs, they need to say true. We're also going to remove the attribute of tab index. And we're doing that because when they're showing their tab, we're naturally going to have a tab index of -1 on each of these. We didn't do that last time, as I recall, so let's come in here and let me show you why we would do that. So each of these, you'll notice that they're just in the normal tab order. So if I were to tab through these, they're just going to keep going like this, which means if you want to skip this list, you can't. You have to tab through all of them. So what we're going to do is come into each of these like this. Actually, let's go ahead and just select roll tab like this, and let's just select, I think we've got 4 more, 1, 2, 3, 4, like that. And let's add after these, let's see, tab index equals -1, like that. Now, if I save it here, because I've made them all that way, I can't tab to any of them, so I definitely don't want that. What I want is on the first one here that's already active, that's already saying selected true. I'm going to remove that so I can tab to that. Let's go to the second grouping here, down below. If only I had a mini map like that sitting waiting for me. Let's remove this as well. Okay. So let's go ahead and make sure that that works properly. So I should be able to tab to this first one, then the panel, then any buttons, then to the next one, and then to the panel. Okay, so perfect. So -1 is all the other ones. We don't want to be able to tab to those by default. We want people to be able to skip them if they're using their keyboard. But when the tab is active, we want them to obviously be able to tab to that. Okay, so we want them to all be able to show their tabs. We also want them to be all to be able to hide their tabs. And this is just a little bit different. We're going to change this to false. Let's see, false, like that. And then let's go ahead and copy this down because we're going to set the tab index now back to -1. So when they hide, we want them to be taken out of the flow of those tabs. Finally, we do want them to be able to focus as well. So when they're moving their keyboard here in a little bit, when we set that up, we want them to be able to focus on the tab. And here, all we're going to do is say this.tab.focus. So I'm going to go ahead and save that. Now we've got this tab class. So what we can do here is we want to make sure that for each of the items in this array, we actually send them through that class so they get those different methods attached to them. So we could do something like a for each loop, but that would require a little bit more work than is necessary. This is already an array, so we have array methods available to us. One of those methods is map. What we'll say is we're going to take our tab, we'll just call it T here, and for each tab, we want to create a new, that's that keyword again, tab with the tab, just like that. And now when we do that and we come back this way, you'll notice that we do have our array of tabs, and each of them looks similar, but if we expand them, they now have a prototype that includes the constructor that created them, then these 3 methods that we just created. So they all are going to have access to this from their prototype, which is what we want. Now the cool thing is, now that we've done this, we can just take this down like this, and we're going to initialize the panels the same way. So we're going to say initialize panels. Let's copy this down, and then what we're going to do is just basically duplicate this exact same process. Now, since we've already done the check at the ID up here at the tabs, we don't need to do it again here. So we'll just remove this section, and this will be even shorter. This time, we're not looking for the role of tab, but the role of tab panel. And we're going to pass this to not new tab, but new panel. And then let's change this from a T to AP. So it makes a little more sense. Now, we're going to get yelled at because we haven't created this yet. So let's go ahead and create it. Let's copy this one down. And now that we've already done this once, it's going to be pretty quick to do this again. So we'll say panel here, and then this is going to be panel, panel, like that. And then we're going to have, let's see, show panel and hide panel is all we're going to need here. Let's see, show panel like that. Okay, and let me remove this focus tab. We don't need that. What we're going to set here is this. Oh, this should be lowercase. I guess I changed all those, sorry. Now we don't want to set an attribute here. We're actually going to just remove an attribute. So what is the attribute we set on it to hide it? Well, it was the attribute hidden, like that. So we're just going to remove it when we show the panel. That means when we hide the panel, all we'll need to do is set the attribute of hidden to pizza, right? That's it. It's going to stay that way. All right, so we're going to set the hide attribute to it. Now, that means when we come back here and look at our console logged instance here of this tab list, we've now got panels as well, and each of these panels, if we expand it, now have access to all of those methods that we just wrote. So we've got everything set for this tab list now to be operational except for the event listeners. So let's come down here and we're going to say, let's go ahead and just run a method on this immediately. This.event, let's see, add listeners. How about that? All right, so we don't have that written yet, so let's come down here. What we're going to do is write a method and then just immediately invoke it so that the event listener gets attached to this instance. We could also do it on the window and just look for anything that was clicked inside of a tab list, but I think it's easier just to connect it to the instance. It's only going to be 3 event listeners, basically, or 2 event listeners, because we only have 2 tab groups. So let's write this function called add listeners here. And the first thing we need to do is look at what we're going to add the listeners on. We're going to add it to the actual tab list itself. Now, even though we passed in the ID, we don't actually have any property on the class, on the instance here, that points to the specific tab list. So why don't we just do it like this? Let's just say const tab list is equal to document.query selector. And we're going to have in here, again, this same set that we set up top. So this.id, so the thing that's passed in here. and I need to add a $sign there. Undo a space, and here we're going to look again for role equals tab list. So rather than tabs, I guess we're looking at tab list because it's the thing that holds those tabs. All right, so now that we've got access to that, we're going to use that to write click events and keyboard down events. Let's start with the click events, and we're going to say tablist.add event listener. Now you might ask, why aren't we adding the event on the tabs themselves, the individual tabs? It's because we can use the tab list and just set one event listener for all the buttons that are contained in there, and that cuts down on the amount of event listeners that we're adding, and that's usually best practice. So I'm going to say on click here, I'm going to want to write a function here that this is going to reference, and this will be activate panel. We're going to pass it just like that and let the browser run it itself. Now, this actually is not going to work when we get around to it, but I want to do it this way first to kind of show you why. Let's come outside this function and write another method here, another function, and this one's going to be called, you guessed it, activate panel. It's going to take in the event from the event listener. And the first thing we need to check for is what we're clicking in, because you'll notice we've got these little blank areas here. So before we do anything here, let's console.log the e.target. Target, like that. Okay, so if I come in here, activate panel is not defined. Activate panel. Oh, I have to do this.activate panel. Okay, so if I come in here and I click, you'll notice I'm getting the tab list, and now I'm getting the button, and now I'm getting the button. If I click between, I get the tab list again. So the first thing we need to check for is if e.target, that's the thing that was clicked upon, is the same as e.current target, which is the thing that the event listener was set against. So it was set on the tab list. If when we click, we're actually clicking on the tab list and not a button, then we just want to return directly. So assuming we're now clicking on a button, we want to say this.tabs.forEach tab. And I'll just do a little arrow function here. e.target.id, if it's equal to our tab.tab.id. Now, the reason I'm doing .tab is because that's the way we set up this property on it. It's .tab. So this is the instance, this is the property of tab, and this is the ID. If those match, so if you've clicked on the tab that has the same ID as one of our instances, then go ahead and that's the instance, run that method, show tab, like that. Otherwise, hide tab. All right, so if it's not the case, then just hide it. We're going to want to do the same thing for our panels. So we're going to say this.tab shows like that, and then this.panel, or panels, I guess. For each of these panels, we're looping through that array that we got up top. We're going to say we want to take the P. And this time we're going to look at, we could do it this way, but it would require kind of going down the tree here. So what we're going to do instead of looking for the ID is we're going to look for the get attribute on the e.target that we click on, get attribute. And remember, we set an aria controls that points to the tab, or the panel that this tab controls. And so when we click on the tab, we can then look at that to see which panel we should be pointing to. And when we do that, we can come in here and say p.panel, so the instance.property of panel.id. If that's the same, then go ahead, and this time we're going to say p.show panel, like this, and p.hide panel, like this. Now if I save this, everything should work, but when I click, notice it's saying cannot read property. Well, what's going on here? Let's go ahead and console log. Let's console log this, all right, and see what we're getting when we click. So you'll notice I'm getting the tab list itself. What I really want to get is the instance. So this should point to the instance, not to the tab list. Why is it pointing to the tab list? Well, this is always set, the keyword this is always set where it's called, and it's called here against the tab list. And because functions change the scope of this, normal functions change the scope of this, dependent on where they're called, this has now changed from the instance to now the tab list itself, which is not what I want. So there's a couple ways we could get around this. The first thing is to use an arrow function, because the arrow function doesn't change this keyword. It doesn't redefine it. So I could just come in here and add a little arrow function, and I'll wrap this here and just say, now I need to actually call it and pass along the event itself. And now if I do the same thing and click, I should now get access to the tab list itself. All right, so that is good. What's not good is somehow I've messed up a method on show panel or hide panel, it looks like. So to look at this error trace here, I'm getting errors that are tracing all the way down and telling me kind of what's happening. And what we're going to look at here is that set attribute hidden to pizza doesn't seem to be working. Do you see the problem here? Notice what I've called this against, this dot tab, not this dot panel. You've probably seen that the entire time, but when you're copying stuff over, sometimes you don't see that, but thankfully it'll throw you a little error here. That means if we click here, it should allow us to actually show and hide the proper panel. Now it's not actually switching the text here. Let me make sure that we even change the text. Man, this is how real life goes right here. Let's see, step 2, what is HTML? Yeah, we never changed the text. Okay, let's go ahead and do that, and I'll be right back with you. Okay, I went ahead and changed some things just so you can actually see it change. This is why you should not talk and code at the same time. All right, so now you're seeing each of these change like that, which is cool. All right, now in addition to these click events, one more thing we want to add to make it more accessible is some keyboard events. But since we've done all this work on getting these methods up and running, it should be fairly quick to get up and going. So we've got click events here, and now let's add keyboard events like this. So once again, we're going to call our tab list here, .add event listener. And this time we're going to listen for a key down event. And whenever that happens, we're going to, again, writing this as an arrow function so that it passes reference to the proper this. It doesn't rescope that, redefine that for us. And before we do anything, we're going to write a little guard clause here because we only want to interact with keyboard events when we're actually selected on a tab list itself. So let's just do a little guard clause that says if not the tab list dot contains, if it doesn't contain the document dot active, let's see, active element like that, then we're going to just go ahead and return. So we don't want to mess with it if that's the case. Assuming that now it is active, we're going to write a little switch statement that's going to look at the e.key, so the name of the key that was passed in. For each of these, we're going to have a little case. We're going to start with the home button, which this is kind of standard practice when you have a series of things that if you hit home or end, it will jump you to the beginning or the start of the list, or in this case, the first or the last tab. Then what we're going to do is say e.prevent default, so don't use the normal home thing that would jump to the top of the page. Instead, we want to say this.tabs. We're going to say go to the first tab and focus that tab like this. And then we'll do a break afterwards. All right, so that's the first instance. The second option. The second option would be end. And if that happens, we're going to do the same thing, except this time instead of going to this.tabs, we're going to this.tabs.this.tabs.length minus length, like that, minus 1. Go to the last tab, in other words, and focus on that. Now we've got a couple other options. Let's copy this down one more time. If in the case of a space like this, which is how some older browsers do space bars, or if it's space bar, or if it's enter, then we want to say this dot activate panel like that. And we're going to pass along the event as well. So let's make sure those are working properly. First of all, let's pull up the console just in case we're getting errors. We'll come here and let's see. Oh, I forgot which ones we used. We hadn't done the other ones yet. Let's just do end. That should jump to the end. Home jumps to the beginning. Let's go end again and then hit enter. That should work. Let's go home and hit spacebar and that should work. Okay, cool. Now we've got a few other use cases. Let's say enter. And then the other options we have here would be arrow up. Let's see, arrow up like this. And arrow down, arrow right, and arrow left. Now we need to know if we're direction of vertical or horizontal, which we are going to get from the instance property of dir. dir, I think is what we set that to. Now because arrow up and arrow down would naturally go up and down the screen, let's go ahead and prevent that default in that case. We're going to write one more little method here, but first of all, let's write a ternary to basically decide whether or not we should run the method. So we're going to say if this.dir is not equal to horizontal, which would be the default, horizontal like that, then we're going to say this.move keyboard focus on, we're going to pass it first, and I'll show you why in a second here. We're going to say otherwise do null. So what we're saying here is basically if it's vertical, then we want to do something with this arrow up. let's go ahead and copy this down here. And after arrow up, we're going to have arrow right, because that will be the other way in which we call this as first. And then again, I'll explain that in a second. So on arrow right, here we don't need to prevent the default because it's not going to do anything on the page. And this time we're going to say not equal to, but if it's equal to horizontal, then we want to go ahead and run that. What we're going to do here is pass last. And again, I'll explain that in a second. And then let's copy both these down here. And we're going to change this one to arrow down like this. And here we'll change this to last. And then we're going to change this to arrow left. And that should work properly. Okay, so now we've got all these set up. Let's actually write this move keyboard focus, and I'll show you what this last first thing is all about. Let's see, this one should be first, like this. Okay, so let's come up here outside of this function. Let's write another one, and it's going to take in the E like this. Okay, so what we're going to do is we're going to basically say, hey, if I'm using the arrows and it's not horizontal, so if I'm vertical and I use the up arrow, I want to check to see basically if I'm on the very first in this array, if I'm on the first button. If I am, I want to cycle back through the buttons. All right, and the other instance in which we'd be the first one is if we're hitting arrow left and it's horizontal. That's where we're passing first here. Same thing with arrow right and arrow down. That would be the last in either the horizontal or vertical direction, depending on which direction we've passed in. In that case, then we'd want to basically check and loop back around to the first. So that's what we're going to be passing in here, which means I guess we're not passing the event. Now that I think about it, we're passing in like current index or something like that. Okay, so with this in place, we want to first of all figure out what is the active element. So const get index of active element. And we're going to write this just as a little short one-liner. So this arrow function is just going to say l.tab.id if that's equal to document.active.element.id. So it's just a true-false statement that this is going to return. And as an arrow function, it's naturally going to return to us. What we need to do then is say if current index is equal to first, so if it's arrow up or arrow left, depending on vertical or horizontal, if it gets passed into here, we want to say document.active.element.id is equal to this.tabs 0, so the first tabs, tab.id. All right, let me explain that. If this is going to give us a true-false statement. If this active element.id, so if the active element is the same as the first in this instance of the tabs, if it has the same ID as that instance of the tabs, then this is a little ternary here, and I'm just spacing it out to make it easier to read. Then we want to say this.tabs.this.tabs.length. We want to go to the last one, just like we did below with our keyboard event, I guess, end or home. We'll say, then we want to focus the tabs. Otherwise, and let's actually just copy this down like this. So if we're not the very first, then we just want to find wherever we're currently at and go back up one tab, all right, or back left one tab if we're using the left arrow. So what we're going to do then is say we want tabs.findIndex. What this is going to do is it's going to look at all the tabs in the current instance, so all those individual buttons, and we're going to pass it to the little function we wrote up here. We're going to basically say, hey, if it's the active element, then let us know and find the one before by doing -1 like that, and then we'll focus the tab. Hopefully that makes sense. What I'm going to do now, oh, and I got to close this off here like this. And I realized already I made a mistake up here. You'll get nothing but the truth here, all right? And then we're going to say else like this, and I got to change this to a colon. Okay, finally. Then we're going to say otherwise, and let's just copy all this down here. If the first wasn't passed in, then we know last was passed in. And rather than checking if we're on the first tab, we're going to check if we're on the last tab, and we can do that like this. And then we can switch this out to 0. So we're going to say if we're on the last tab, if we hit the down arrow, in other words, or the right arrow, depending if it's vertical or horizontal, we'll go back to the first one. And then otherwise, if it's just anywhere else in the array, we're going to do the same thing, except instead of going to the up or to the left, we're going to go to the down or to the right. So we're going to do, let's see, +1 like this. All right, hopefully that made sense. Let me come in here. If we come down here, you see that it should just automatically move like that. And if I jump to this other one, we haven't actually set up an event listener on this. All right, so we're good on functionality, but let's go ahead and add, let's see, let's remove this console log. Let's add another list here of 2. and this should point to list 2, and hopefully that works since we finally got around to changing that. Now, if I come in here and hit over, you'll notice it's not moving over. Now, both of these are showing that the tab list is undefined. I must have a console log somewhere else that I left. Let's find that. Console.log, yeah, this, okay, on the active panel. Well, for now it helped us because it showed us that that was undefined. So what we want to do is, let's go back to our tab list here and say this needs to be either the direction or by default, we'll call it horizontal, like that. Okay, so now if I come in here, let's see, this should work properly. If I come in here and I space down, let's go to the next one, and now I should be able to hit over and it should work properly as well. So they'll always work for right and left arrows, but now we just need to remember to pass in vertical for this one. So if I come down here, I should be able to pass in here vertical, like that, and then this should work properly. If I come in here, yeah, now the down arrow works, and if I jump over to this next one, now the right and left arrows work, but the down and up don't do anything. Now, rather than typing these all out, wouldn't it be great if they could just figure it out itself? And so what we're going to do, we're going to lose the identification here, list 1 and list 2, but we don't really need those anymore because we're not going to be using them actively. So what I'm going to do is just write a little function here called init tabs app, like that. So we're going to basically programmatically create these new instances. So we'll say document.query selector all. We're going to pass in the class of tabs wrapper because that's what's wrapping all those article sections. We'll say .for each. We'll just call this tab group, something like that. So for each of these tab groups, we're going to come in here, we're going to pass in a new tab list. We're going to pass in the tab group tab.group.id, and then we'll do the tab group .dataset.direction. Oops. Dataset.direction. Now we haven't actually run this yet, so I need to actually initialize this down here, like this. And now I'm running it as well. And now I should be able to come in here and click, and everything should work properly. Okay, so let's take one final step now, and let's make this a module. That will scope everything, and that's best practice. So what I'm going to do is come up here, let's remove this here, and we're just going to say export default function init tabs app, like this. And then let's go ahead and pull up our side panel. And right now it's yelling at me because it's not a module. And then I'm going to create, let's create a main.js. And inside this main.js file, I'm going to say import. And we could just say default or whatever we want here, but let's call it init tabs app because that's what we called it. And I like that name. Import from, and then here in a relative path, we'll say tabs app.js, like that. And then down here, we're just going to say init tabs app, like that. All right. Now let's come back up to the index.html. We need to change out the reference here. So now we're going to point this to main.js. We're going to add on it type of module, like that. And now it should work properly just like that. And what it's doing is referencing this main.js app is referencing this one function that creates everything and then connects everything that we need so that we can interact with our page. Well, hopefully seeing some of those errors in real time was a help to you because you actually got to kind of see it real in development, coding in public for Rails. Well, thanks so much for following along. If you have questions, leave them in the description. I will catch you next time. Happy coding.